The research in this video is brought to you by the World Leisure Centre of Excellence and the Vancouver Island University Department of Recreation and Tourism Management. A team of researchers have been exploring the impacts of public health restrictions on leisure behavior with funding from VIU's VURAC program. The recording was made on the unceded territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation as part of the Scholarship, Research and Creative Activity Office's Lunch and Learn program.
We're doing some research around COVID-19 public health measures and the impacts of those on leisure behavior, and the use of leisure as a coping strategy. Our research team is myself and Garrett Stone, who's joined us today, Farhad Magimafar, Amanda Johnson. All of us are with the Department of Recreation and Tourism Management, and Jackie Onsescu, who is with the with University of New Brunswick, but she used to be with us, which is partly how she became part of this. The research is supported through VIU or VURAC funding through the SRCA, and of course our departmental work is through Recreation and Tourism Management and the World Leisure Centre of Excellence. So this is the message that we've all been receiving for the last year. Well, not quite a year, but pretty close to a year. Keep calm and stay home, which of course really impacts on leisure if your leisure isn't home-based. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is some preliminary results focusing on the importance of leisure activities to participants' well-being, and then the impacts of COVID-19 public health measures on people's ability to engage in their leisure, normal leisure activities. And I'll speak to some of the lessons we've learned, both about that, but also about online research in the pandemic and where we're moving to next. So to provide a little bit of a background, our overall research project is trying to better understand whether those who have a broader leisure repertoire are more resilient in the face of public health restrictions. And leisure repertoire is the idea that you have a wide variety of leisure activities that you participate in, but you also have this skill set to move through those and to take on new activities. Individuals that are highly specialized often don't have the ability to fulfill those needs that are filled with one activity from another activity, whereas those with a broad leisure repertoire can not only move from one activity to another that they're already part of, but they have a skill set for developing new leisure activities. We're also looking in what ways did individuals use leisure to cope with stress associated with COVID-19, and did participants experience post-traumatic growth from navigating the public health restrictions and the stress? Those last two questions I won't be touching on today. They'll come forward in future presentations as we move into that analysis. So what does the literature say about this topic? The literature basically tells us that leisure is beneficial, but, and here's the really big but, it's particularly social leisure that can have an important factor for dealing with stress. And part of that is that through our leisure connections, we develop social capital. We become connected to individuals who then can provide us the support necessary to make it through tougher times. Engagement in leisure is important for maintaining physical, emotional, and mental health. This is clearly supported in the literature. Research on social determinants of health has shown that leisure engagement and social connections can be more important than even having extreme wealth as a determinant of health, or being wealthy, not even extreme wealth, and being wealthy once your basic needs are met. And the other thing that we know is that one's leisure repertoire is largely dependent on those leisure activities that we were exposed to during our childhood and adolescence. We are 40% more likely to do an activity as an adult that we did as a child or an adolescent. And so as adults, we become less resilient to taking on new activities than we were when we were a child. So, which means something like a pandemic that really interrupts us and interrupts our participation may impact on our ability to broaden our leisure repertoire if it was narrow to begin with. So methods in sampling, talk about the research element of this. We did an online questionnaire and it was very long. That's the one thing I would say. It's a very long questionnaire. And that definitely impacted on both our response rate and our completion rate. So we had 194 participants complete our survey. We had well over 200 people start our survey. And so we'll need to look at that in the future. And one element of this is how do we best sample for leisure repertoire? And when you put together a group of academics who are really passionate about leisure, it may not be the best group to narrow down that list. But we ended up having over 66 activities that we wanted to measure people's use of that activity for their well-being, and also if they did that activity, how it changed once the pandemic started. We shared that through our social media channels, both personal and professional, and through the use of Facebook and Instagram ads that targeted Canadians over the age of 14, but not a lot of sort of marketing characteristics beyond that. We really were trying to get as wide a network as we possibly could. And we felt that the questions we were asking would be understandable by anyone sort of in their mid-teens. And so we did have ethical approval to target individuals 14 and older. 19 was the youngest person that we ended up attracting to our survey. Data collection began in August and it ran through the fall. And the second phase of data collection will start soon. I just need to get my button here. But the second phase will focus locally and will use telephone survey. So a slight alteration to the existing survey and will be a phone survey based in the Nanaimo area. One of the other things we did is we drove updates and promotion through through a Facebook page that's attached to my professional account. And that's the link to that. So it's leisure stress coping is sort of the title that we've given our work. So just to give you an idea of a little bit of the sample characteristics, the vast majority of our participants, over 70%, were female. This is probably likely due to some of our social networking. Our team is about 50-50 in a gender split, but our two male team members, neither of them are Canadian. So a lot of their social network would not have been qualified for the study because they are not Canadian, and we were focusing on Canadian residents for this one. I was really impressed with our distribution over age. It was a pretty even split across. You'll notice that it's not 20 to 29 years, and that's because we had one 19-year-old, so I didn't want to have a bar for just the 19-year-old. And so you can see we're sort of reasonably well split between the 19 and the 69 years, and then we have a handful of individuals slightly above that. Maximum age was 84, and the average age was 46. Our sample did tend to be a little bit more heavily distributed on the higher income side. Again, likely due to the participants in the networking, so the sampling that we did. I know a lot of my network who completed it were individuals who were also leisure researchers or who worked in university settings, so would have a higher than average income. Now, this was an interesting one because this is employment status as it related to COVID. So we were looking for their employment status, but also how their employment status had been impacted by the COVID-19 public health measures and pandemic in general. We saw a fairly significant portion of the group didn't change. They remained employed, and the no change signifies that they are going about their day as exactly as it was pre-COVID. A little more than 20% switched to working at home. We have about 8% of individuals who are working more hours than they were working beforehand. A few that were working reduced hours. We do see about 13% were laid off. Now, a number of those individuals indicated later in the survey that some of those layoffs were temporary. The other category is predominantly retired individuals, and then some individuals who indicated being laid off or temporary, or some who chose to stop working while their partner was laid off, or to provide homeschooling time. So indicated that their employment really hadn't changed, but they had taken a holiday or a leave in order to provide that home support during, and that they had since returned to work. So focusing specifically on the leisure behavior question, participants were asked to indicate how important a series of leisure activities were to their well-being. The first potential response was that they didn't participate in that activity at all. If they didn't participate in that activity, they would just be automatically moved to the next activity and asked about that one. If they did indicate that they participated, and it didn't matter whether it was extremely unimportant to their personal well-being or extremely important to their personal well-being, they would then be sent to a question specific to that leisure activity and asking how their participation changed due to COVID-19 public health restrictions. We were specifically telling them to focus on the time before things opened up. So when the restrictions were at their toughest, which is between March and May 31st. The results that I'm going to present to you, I'm going to present only the very important or very important to well-being, rather than all of those. That'll give you a sense of how the participants viewed those activities that actually did them. And then I've provided stacked bar charts as far as how participation has changed. The green bars represent not being able to do the activity or doing it significantly less. The orange in the middle, it represents stable participation. So there was no real change in the amount that they were able to do that activity. And the blue bars represent somewhat more and a lot more participation in that activity. Okay, let's go through. So there are some activities you can see here that are, and just so you know, these are only the individuals who actually did this activity are included in these totals. And so we can see activities like walking being very important to someone's well-being. And other activities such as playing in a band, even though it's an activity that individuals did, it's not something that they identified as being particularly important to their overall well-being. One of the other things to note as we're moving through here is the difference between activities that are happening sort of either home-based or in outside venues versus those that are happening in traditional recreation spaces or indoor facilities. Because while we look at the importance here, we then come here and we look at how that behavior changed. And so when we start looking at visiting museums, going to movies, and other activities, we quickly see that the behavior almost stopped, right? So the orange shows some stability, but in many of these cases, participation upwards of 80% was either reduced or completely eliminated. And that's when those facilities were shut down and access what hasn't been opened up again. Oh, there should have been one in between there. Oh, there we go. So looking at a few more activities. So water sports, proving for some to be an important for their well-being. Swimming. I have to be honest, I was a bit surprised that golf was so low. It tends to be one of those activities that we see a lot of, but it is also an activity that's more associated with a male population than a female population. So our sample probably plays into that. We also see activities like watching and streaming live sport. So sometimes it's not so much that you can't do the activity anymore, but the activity disappeared. So same with attending sports events and so forth. So when we move into how participation changed on these ones, you can see where attending live sports events, it either remained the same or completely disappeared for them. Those were ones that were shut down. Even the watching and streaming of live sport largely disappeared. There was still, during this time frame, there was still some countries and some leagues that were maintaining. A secondary question that I would have for those individuals is, did they switch their sports? If you know, American and Canadian football were no longer possible to watch, did they start watching European soccer or picking up something else? And the other thing that we saw networks do is start offering sort of heritage games, and so you could watch the Stanley Cup from 30 years ago or 40 years ago and have those nostalgic moments. You'll notice that there's some activities like golfing, water sports, and swimming that show both some people stopping and some people growing those activities. There were some jurisdictions across Canada where golf courses closed down during that time, but there was other jurisdictions where they did not. And swimming in facilities like arenas, or sorry, like pools shut down. But this also covered a time frame where people would be picking up, you know, going to the beach or going to the river. I know that here in Nanaimo, one of the swim clubs changed from swimming in the pool to swimming up at Westwood Lake. So we do see some growth in areas. And then we look at activities like photography, where, you know, the bulk of the people either stayed stable or there was quite a growth. It's an outdoor activity. It was deemed safe in many regions. They were encouraging us to continue going outside. So it really shows that activities that can be a little bit less structured, can be a little bit more spontaneous, seem to be ones where participation can be more resilient in the face of these restrictions. This was really exciting for me to see that spending time with nature is so important. And that camping is up there because these are things that I'm passionate about. But we start looking at some of these activities. This is a list that, with the exception of figure skating and fitness training and exercise, they're not highly dependent on indoor facilities. I guess the visiting cultural sites can be more facility-based. So this provides us a fairly nice example for how did this translate into participation during the pandemic. And this is one of those ones where, you know, that cultural heritage sites, we see some drop off in that one. Some in the rock climbing one, which initially surprised me. And then I thought about how many people actually in urban centers climb in gyms rather than outdoor spaces. And those climbing gyms would have been closed. Fitness centers in a lot of jurisdictions didn't close. We had a very short closure in British Columbia, and then we opened up again. But then you look at something like figure skating, where participation dropped off or remained the same. Now, this is one of the challenges with our data collection, is we don't actually know the extent of participation. So it might have remained the same because it might have been an activity that someone does only a few times a year, and it wasn't that time of year they would typically do it anyway. Where we see the growth areas are in cycling and mountain biking, and anybody who tried to buy a bike during the pandemic can attest that it's been very difficult. We see a large growth in the amount of time spent in nature and some growth in the camping. Those are the types of leisure activities that were really made available to us during this time. The fitness and training, exercising, we saw an explosion of online training, as well as an explosion of the home gym. It became another area where it was really difficult to buy leisure equipment, was home fitness equipment. This list has many more activities that are home-based, individual, don't generally require the provision of the leisure spaces by public recreation, with the exception of attending festivals. Attending festivals tends to be one that is large crowds of people and put together or put online, put together and organized and offered by community recreation, tourism organizations. And so when we look at the importance to well-being here, you know, spending time on social media, over 40% indicated that was important or very important. And that's prior to the pandemic. Pets and animals, over 50%. Cooking, baking, and canning, over 50%. But when we look at how participation was impacted, we see a really dramatic response here. Attending festivals almost disappeared completely. Right? Almost 80% of individuals indicated they could no longer participate in that, yet it was an activity that was highly important to well-being. The gambling, we saw some stable behavior, but we see some growth in online gambling. So a leisure activity that doesn't necessarily have the most positive outcomes for individuals. So just because it's a leisure activity doesn't mean it's always a good thing. But we see other activities where we see lots of growth. Doing puzzles. So people picking up that opportunity to doing those things at home. We have a sort of a split with board games. And part of this can be explained by the fact that approximately 60% of our sample lived in a household of 1 to 2 people. And so the remaining 40% would potentially have a number of people, so three to 6 people to participate in playing board games. There are online gaming, but this question really focused on the, you know, being in the same physical space. And 20% of our sample lived alone. And so particularly in those initial restrictions, those would be the individuals who would no longer be able to do those activities. Not surprising, we see a real uptake in gaming. I'm teaching course right now with the fourth years in the Bachelor of Tourism Management, and we've had quite a discussion about this, and the number of students who started gaming because it was a social activity. They do the online multiplayer games where they're talking to their friends, and so it's one way to connect through that, and so definitely a place for further research. Social media use has exploded. Now, again, not all leisure is a positive thing, and so there is growing concerns about the impact of that particular activity on individuals. There has in our sample there was a growth in time with pets. We know across the board there has been an explosion in pet adoptions. Just like we know that there has been a real growth in people taking up cooking and baking. I have a whole cupboard full of what I call COVID canning. We saw handicrafts, gardening, and some activities of picnicking and eating outside. So really, we're seeing a pattern that traditional leisure activities tend to be hit. So traditional facility-based leisure activities tended to be hit harder than those that we can do at home. So here's another list that is a bit of a mix of activities that require being with other people or being in certain facilities, or ones that are very much independent and we can drive the experience ourselves. So we have dining out and shopping and going to bars, but we also have listening to music and reading, just relaxing, visiting family, all as being elements, and spending time with friends as being highly important elements to people's well-being. Some of those which are still able to continue, but when we look at the spending time with friends and spending time visiting family, those are two activities that have been largely curtailed, which as public, as people looking at the public services, can be potentially a worrisome thing. When we look at how that participation changed, not surprising, massive drop in spending time with friends. A few people spent more time with friends. We need to dig a little bit deeper to see whether or not those potentially are individuals who are in their household or whether they combined to form a little bit of a bubble. We see a massive drop off in volunteering because a lot of companies and organizations either stopped offering their services or they really shrunk their volunteer groups. That can be highly problematic for a lot of individuals, as that's their social contacts, but also where their sense of purpose comes from. Visiting family has also dropped off dramatically. Where you see the talking with friends, family and friends is the third one from the top. That really grew. That is through technology. And so that is that online chatting with family and friends. So people were definitely finding strategies on how to overcome that. Spa treatments, dining out, shopping in general, going pubs and bars. During the time we were having the individuals focus on those were largely closed, or there was still so much fear that people weren't necessarily rushing out to do those activities as they reopened. Relaxing, reading, listening to music, watching TV. These are all things that grew. On one hand, we can look at them and go, okay, these are all sedentary leisure activities, which can be a little bit worrying. At the same time, they are leisure activities that bring about different benefits. And so individuals who have that wider repertoire were able to fill some of that time. So what does all this mean? Because I mean, that was a lot of bars and a lot of well-being and dropped participation. What we learn is that participants have a wide variety of leisure activities that are important to their well-being. And those associated with facilities and events were most impacted by the public health measures. At the same time, many of our large research studies that come from Stats Canada and other places really focus on that public leisure offering, and don't spend as much focus on some of the other activities that are more individual in nature or more spontaneous in nature. I think in some ways because, or for some reasons, it could be because of, there's less policy implications or service offerings in those ideas, but it is something for us to be a bit more aware of. Whereas with our study, we tried to have a fairly holistic list so that we could speak to the breadth of activities that people do for leisure. While traditional municipal recreation and sport programming was hit hard, many of those activities weren't particularly important to people's well-being. And again, remember that well-being is marked as the people who actually did those activities, not people who don't do them at all. And so one of the things that we need to consider is, what are the benefits that are being achieved through the leisure that we're providing from a municipal perspective? Because it costs a lot of money and it's really important, but who are we serving in that? And what are we achieving? Social leisure is reinforced as the core to participants' well-being. When you look at the activities that allow for them to socialize, for participants to socialize with others, that was they were the ones that were most strongly aligned with well-being. They were also the ones that were most heavily impacted by public health restrictions. And while in the moment of managing a crisis, it makes sense to have these public health restrictions, as we move forward, we're going to have to take a look into some of the other unintended consequences that come from social isolation, and whether or not there needs to be taken a different approach taken, or other measures that we can take so that we're not creating secondary crises through the initial public health restrictions. As I noted, approximately 60% of our participants had one or two people living in the house, and so some of our initial public health restrictions have really led to increased social isolation for those individuals. One of the things that's changed from the first wave to the second wave is that there is policies now put in place for individuals who are living alone, and being able to join with one or two other households as part of their household bubble, recognizing that solitary confinement is inhumane. Leisure activities where participation was home-based proved to be the highest rates of increased participation. So it's things that you're able to do on a spontaneous, indoor or outdoor perspective, that don't require a lot of other people or a lot of infrastructure and equipment investment, were definitely the most resilient. And we saw high levels of importance and participation in nature-based and outdoor physical activities. And in part, I think, because we've had some individuals like Dr. Bonnie Henry here in BC who have stressed the importance of those activities as safe places to play and maintain our health while we're doing this. The other thing that I think has become clear is that the near complete shutdown of recreation and sport facilities and the team and group activities has revealed the resilience of outdoor physical activities and nature-based activities within these pandemic settings, and the ability to maintain participation in those. Which raises the question that, given the benefits associated with the type of activities, outdoor and nature-based, so physical and mental health, that we may need to rethink our approach to physical education and public recreation, which has typically been much more focused on group and team activities and facility-based provision of those activities. And we need to question whether or not a leisure education model that helps individuals broaden their leisure repertoire and their leisure skills may provide or prove to be more useful from a societal perspective, should we ever face one of these again. And then I'll just wrap up with a couple of research reflections, since we have some developing researchers in the group. The massive inventory of leisure activities resulted in a massive drop-off in completion. In our second phase, we're actually asking people to list the 5 most important leisure activities, which will also allow us to get to activities that we may not have thought about because they're not necessarily common or important in our leisure repertoire. And then we'll ask how their participation changed in those specific activities. So really, so taking almost, 230 questions or 130 questions and shrinking it down to 10. Social networks and Facebook ads were useful in getting the word out, but I still think that they ended up narrowing the potential pool due to the nature of who our social networks were, and the persuasive ability of us versus ads in getting people to respond. And our sample was clearly skewed to higher incomes and individuals who did not experience significant drops in income, though we know that's not the reality of everyone. So phase 2 data collection will be via a phone survey, and we'll also focus on the Nanaimo area in an attempt to get a better cross-section of participants. And that is the end. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much.
Questions.
Thank you so much, Aggie. I have a question, and then if everybody is okay to stay for maybe 5 more minutes. So at one point you mentioned that social isolation is inhumane.
Yes.
And that really struck me, and I was wondering if you could reflect a bit more on that for us.
So when we look at, and I'm making a bit of a leap in my jump here. So when we look at one of the biggest issues for reform in the penitentiary system, so in jails, it is calling into question the practice of solitary confinement. And while I am never going to equate staying in your 1-bedroom condo downtown Toronto with being in solitary confinement in a penitentiary, we have to recognize that social beings are used to interacting with other social beings, and that even just having one other human being in your space provides a level of connection and a level of benefit psychologically and emotionally that not having that person does. And that our lived experiences in places like Nanaimo, where many of our condos and apartments have balconies, or we were able to go to public parks and interact in those spaces, is not the lived experience of everyone everywhere. And early on in this pandemic, I listened to an interview on CBC of a young woman living in Toronto. She lived in one of those giant high towers where she had windows, no balcony. It was one of those, 300 to 400 square foot homes where she was the only person in that space. And she was pleading at that time for people to change their behaviors so they would remain allowed to go to public parks, because she not only said that's the only time that she really saw another human being, but it was also the only time she got into a green space. It was the only time she got out of that space that she was living in. And that just made me really think about humanity and in our different experiences, and how being forced to stay indoors and away from other people is a little bit inhumane. It's a pretty strong statement, I know, but that's kind of where I land on that one.
Yep. Thank you. I really appreciate your honesty there. Are there any other questions?
I'll ask a quick question.
Okay.
Do you know the geographical distribution of your sample? or if you mentioned it and I missed it, I'm sorry.
We do, or I should say, we have the data to calculate it. This is one of those ones where I'm like, if I had to do this over again, I would do it differently. We ask for people's postal codes because postal codes will actually allow us to drill down a lot deeper than just knowing you live in Toronto or you live in BC. The problem is cleaning up that data is a nightmare and a half. And so quite honestly, Meg, I just haven't got to it yet. I do know from a quick scan through, we have, and because a couple of people sent me messages to say, hey, I did the survey, that we do have cross country. And we did have representation of people who lived in most of the different restriction levels. But the period that we had people focus on from a leisure behavior perspective, we were all pretty much across the country, with the exception of Alberta, we were all pretty much in the same levels of restriction. And it's just because Alberta has never been in the same level of restriction as anybody else. Okay, other questions? Come on, Whitty and Liam. There's no hiding when you're one of my students.
Yeah, I have a question. I know you mentioned that you were not going to speak to post-traumatic growth,
yep.
But I was just wondering in terms of the definition of resilience in your study, how that relates to post-traumatic growth, and if you have any preliminary results to share and maybe a brief description of what post-traumatic growth is.
Wow, just ask me an easy softball question. Okay, so one, I have no results to share with you. We need to still do the sort of the reverse coding on some of the scale items and then aggregation and whatnot. Post-traumatic growth, I'll deal with that one first. And Garrett, feel free to jump in at any time on this one. But it is the idea that as we successfully negotiate something and survive something, that there is some growth that happens. And the literature on post-traumatic growth speaks to some of the most, what I would consider some like really horrific incidences of trauma. And for everything from, personal violations associated with, sexual assault, to natural disasters and, extreme accidents and those sorts of things, that in the process of surviving that, there is growth, that we learn lessons from that, and we can learn to overcome that in ways that also allows us to be stronger in the face of other traumas and other challenges. Resilience is the idea that you find ways to going on, contextually it makes a little bit of difference. But when I talked about activities being resilient, really what it meant is that in the face of barriers and public health restrictions, people were finding a way to continue their participation, and in some cases increasing their participation. And when we talk about resilience in people, it is about overcoming challenges and not necessarily coming out of the other side doing it exactly the same way, and offering, going back to that quote unquote normal that everyone keeps talking about. But I think it is that ability to ebb and flow and evolve into something new. Garrett, anything you want to add to that?
Nope, you nailed it. No, that was a really good description. Yeah.
Well, I think our time is up. Thank you so much, Aggie. That was so interesting. Lots of food for thought, and I'm really thinking a lot about that. Isolation is inhumane, especially in our own city where we've blocked off a lot of parks and things like that with your reference there. And so yeah, really much appreciated. And thanks for attending, everybody.
Excellent. Thanks, Tanis.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for attending.
We'd like to thank the SRCA for hosting us as part of their Lunch and Learn series. And if you're interested in more information, please don't hesitate to email aggie@aggie.wayhill@viu.ca, or you can follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/leisure stress coping. We thank you for taking the time to learn about our research, and we urge you to think more about how much leisure matters.